Good day, grade 12s. So this is going to be lesson 2 about My Children, My Africa. I'm going to be teaching you about the themes today. So if you remember, last time we chatted, we went through the entire drama. Today, we are going to go through the themes, and I'll tell you why. First of all, let's just look at the setting. So the setting, we remember from the last lesson, 1984 during the apartheid era. Apartheid was made legal in 1948. I'm giving you the setting again so that when we start to discuss the themes, you're going to understand. So remember now, the Bantu Education Act of 1953 has been passed, and this is the act that is causing Tami to become an activist. His fight for equal education is based on what this act meant. Okay, it happens at number 1 classroom in Brakwater, and that's the township, but you've already done this, you know this, right? So, themes. What are themes? Let's discuss them in a little bit more detail. So, themes are universal messages. What does that mean? It means that when you hear a theme, you are able to, at some point in your life, have the ability to relate to what has been said. Let's look at education. So, in this drama, education is a theme. Are you able to identify with that, grade 12? You are, because currently you are struggling to decide, should I go to school and get the education, or should I stay home because of Corona? So there's your theme and your ability to connect with that theme, and that's why themes are called universal messages. The next one is privilege versus poverty. Once again, this is very relevant today, and that is why it is a universal message, because some learners are struggling in terms of being able to access school, and others find it easier because of various reasons. Justice. Oh, my mommy is so unfair. Justice. She allows my brother this, she doesn't allow me this. Justice. Can we all identify? Of course we can. Language and literature, and that's why I'm here today. You know, you are always asking yourself, why is she making this poem mean something other than what the author intended? You know why? Because I know what the author intended, and I want you to understand what the author intended. Debate and order. Now, beginning of the drama, there's a debate, an inter-school debate, and what does Mr. M do? He shouts, order! Why does he shout order? Because he wants them to be quiet, he wants to make himself heard. But the beauty of that is the introduction of this theme, because when Mr. M does that, he sets the scene. And the fact that it's at a debate, beautiful for me, is because later on he says, but why can't black and white people have a conversation? Why can't we use words? So the debate and order, as much as it is a theme, it's a symbol of Mr. M's thinking. Power of words versus violence, gender differences, generation gap, tradition and culture. So, the first one, education. Now, Mr. M is a traditionalist. What is a traditionalist? What does that mean? Mr. M believes that if he says, do this, his learners must do what he says. I've highlighted his judgment because he feels, I am the alpha male, I will tell you, you will do. And education, there it links with his tradition and his culture, because he doesn't do that with Isabel. He does that with the black learners. He does that with Tami. Mr. M doesn't accept the inferior Bantu education system. How do we know that? Because Mr. M teaches all his learners to think outside the box. Imagine for a second, if you were in a classroom and you were told to think in only one way, but somewhere else you had learned about different things. Someone had introduced you to different ways of thinking. And you can take this thing that you've learned and you can make it applicable in various areas of your life. Now, Mr. M says that he sabotaged the system from within. And who did he do that with? Most especially with Tami. And how is there evidence of that theme, that he sabotaged the Bantu education system from within with regard to the education that he gave Tami? The evidence or the proof is in the pudding. When Tami decides, I am leaving school, I am becoming an activist, what led him to that point? Somehow, Mr. M led Tami into thinking for himself. And inadvertently, without Tami realizing it, Mr. M was creating a space for him to be able to develop his intellect, his own opinion in terms of the world at large. And then he saw more issues to think of and more issues to address. So, and that is what Mr. M means when he says that he sabotaged the Bantu education system from within. So although limited resources, what is our greatest asset? Our mind, our ability to think. There's a saying that goes, I think, therefore I am. So your mind is what will liberate you, your thinking, your ability to go beyond. And that is what Mr. M managed to teach his learners, and most especially Tami, because Tami, remember, was a favorite. Tami, however, says, Mr. M has taught him to whisper, but there are now others teaching him to shout. Now, this is an example of figurative language, okay? So, although we are concentrating on themes, let me just tie this together for you nicely. We are focusing on themes, but the themes, in order for them to develop, they need characters to do certain things that leads us to see how the theme develops. So I've discussed with you Mr. M and his contribution to the theme of education, Mr. M and his contribution to Tami being an activist with regard to education. And now finally, here I'm discussing what Tami says. He says Mr. M has taught him to whisper. Is that literal or figurative? It's figurative. So Mr. M has taught him to softly speak up against things. Mr. M has introduced him to the beauty of words. But now he's saying there are others who have taught him to shout. Shout about what? And is it literal or figurative? It's figurative, because previously he did it on a small scale. He educated himself. He was the smartest in his class. But those that are teaching him to shout are making him go out into the streets and actively oppose Bantu education. Okay, I think that that's clear enough for you. If not, you can go through the slide again. Let's move to the next one. Now, here I mentioned he has liberated Tami's mind. What is Tami fighting for, grade 12? He's not fighting for freedom. He's fighting for the freedom to equal education. So he wants his mind to be as liberated and have the opportunity to develop, same like Isabel, same like every other white South African at that time. And Mr. M says, but through words, I've liberated your mind. Remember the last time I chatted to you, I said to you, Mr. M had the dictionary and he had the stone. Now that's what he's talking about. Through words and by educating you, I have liberated your mind. Okay, then he goes on to say, if your mind is free, then what happens? It is more effective than violence, because violence leads to suffering. Now, let me explain what he means by that. If you are you're at school, you are having a problem with an educator. If you are able to speak to that person and use your words rather than fight physically, what is the outcome going to be? Will you not be more listened to and more heard? And that is what Mr. M is saying. He's saying, don't fight, because violence begets violence. But words, however, have the power to change, and the change is more effective and it's more lasting. Remember, last week I mentioned to you, in the last lesson I mentioned to you, 26 letters in the alphabet, 60,000 words in the dictionary. And he says to Tami, those 60,000 words are at your disposal. Why do you want to fight? Why do you want to pick up a stone? Now, here, Mr. M is seen as a traitor. Do you remember what led to that? So Mr. M, big proponent of education, he goes outside his classroom and he rings the bell. And he rings and nobody comes. And he goes in class and he's got the register. And on the register, he looks at the desks and they're not there. And he thinks, my children are losing out. I have to do something. What does he choose to do? He gives the names of those learners to the police. Now, that action brands Mr. M a traitor in the eyes of the learners, because they don't understand his motivation for giving in their names. Mr. M simply wanted them to come back to school, because at heart, he was a teacher. He loved his learners. He wanted to educate them. But they called him a traitor because he gave their names. And we know that Mr. M was eventually murdered for that. Let's move on to the next one. Okay, friendship. Now, let me just recap the theme of education. We've touched on Tami and we've touched on Mr. M. The theme of education in the previous one, Isabel, what do you want to become when you grow up, Isabel? I want to be a journalist. No questions asked. End of story. The money's there, the access to university is there. Isabel's going to become a journalist. So education is not really a theme that Isabel plays a big role in. Friendship, however, is. Why? Because the two of them, Isabel and Tami, believe in the power of friendship. How do we know this? So Isabel goes, number one, classroom, and she's going to do the debate now. And she's like, oh my word, I don't know if the learners here are going to understand and be able to speak English and whatever. And they surprise her. And Tami surprises her. And she gains respect for this young man. And they become friends. They build a deep friendship. And that friendship that they have developed, it goes and it surpasses gender, race, privilege, and social barriers. It overcomes all of those. And what do I mean by gender? He's a girl, she's a boy. Doesn't matter. They become friends. Race, she's black. She's white, he's black. Doesn't matter. They see each other. Privilege, she's rich, he's poor. But they still see each other. Social barriers, everything else that's going on in that time during apartheid, and the fact that Isabel for the first time is learning about apartheid, and for the first time she is seeing what is happening in the country. They overcome all of those things and they build this bond of friendship. And their friendship survives because of trust and honesty. And where do we find evidence of the trust and honesty? So after Mr. M is murdered, they meet, Isabel and Tami, and she says to Tami, were you there? Were you part of the mob? And she feels that she can ask him that honestly, and he responds honestly, and he says, no, I went and I warned Mr. M. And that cements their friendship, because he admits what happened and he comes and he greets her and he says goodbye. So that is a very important theme. And we all know that we've lost friends, we've made friends, so we can all sort of identify with the theme of friendship. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Tradition and culture. Oh, who do you think is involved here mostly? Tradition and culture. Mr. M. You know what's interesting about this? Mr. M is viewed as a traditionalist. For me, what is very interesting, and I think that you're going to find it interesting too, is that he follows Confucius. And Confucius, I put it down, is a Chinese philosopher. Chinese, so that's East. Mr. M, the first book he bought himself was a dictionary which contains Western words with Western knowledge. However, he's a traditionalist. Now, what does that tell you about Mr. M? Mr. M, Confucius, Eastern, dictionary, Western, tradition and culture. How do we know this? Tami, you will do the quiz. Uses the dictionary to read out the debate and what it means. Speaks about Confucius and how he saw life. So Mr. M is, he's like an onion. He's an enigma. He's a paradox, because on the one hand, he is a strict authoritarian and he expects his learners to listen to him, and that is where the tradition and the culture come in terms of the African tradition. And I said it there, they must behave in accordance with your ethnic or your tribal culture. And Tami wasn't doing that. I mean, Mr. M expected him to do that. Mr. M said, you cannot become an activist. You cannot go out onto the streets. Tami went. Isabel believes that we cannot be chained to the past. What does that mean, tradition and culture? So just because her parents and her forefathers believed in apartheid did not mean that she had to perpetuate that. It did not mean that she was responsible for their actions. It did not mean that she was part of what had happened. She refuses to be chained to the events of the past, and she builds a friendship with a black boy. So there, she totally surpasses that whole idea of her cultural past and what had happened during the era. Tami, in the debate, right at the beginning, it's called the Great Debate. He refers to women knowing their place. Remember the debate between him and Isabel? And in African culture, Where must women be? In the kitchen. Although he didn't mean that per se, he was not being serious, he was in fact just arguing a point, he does mention that, so makes you wonder. And then Mr. M says that Tami must respect his elders, traditional values. If I say Tami, then you must do, okay? And yeah, I've noted it very well for you, but I've explained it all to you, so I can actually go on to the next slide now. Right, the generation gap. Who's involved in the generation gap, grade 12? And what is the generation gap? Now, remember I said themes are universal messages. Does your mom understand you? Does your dad understand you? You know, do they see things differently to you? And you're thinking like, oh my word, I can't deal with them right now. Why can't they see it must be this way? Why can't they think like this? Why can't they understand me? The generation gap. And that is where we come in opposition to our elders. I know I'm old, but sometimes there's a generation gap between myself and my parents because I might choose to do things a particular way and they want me to do things a different way. Are you with me? So it's not just for young people, eh? It's for younger and older. Doesn't matter how young or old you are. Also, there is the non-violent methods of the elders. Now, who are the elders they're referring to here? Mr. M. And Tami says, you know what, Mr. M? You can't just use words. You need to back up your words by actions. And that's what they mean there, the non-violent methods. Sometimes we actually have to fight for what we want, other than by using words. And then also, Tami does not view education as highly as his elders do. So that statement is not true 100% because he does value education. However, he is not going to put education ahead of the ability to have a quality education. So what he's saying here is that, so the elders took what was offered. That's how highly they valued education. They took what was offered. Bantu Education Act, 1953. Tami does not want that education. So he does not view that education as highly as his elders viewed the education. Because remember, this generation gap. Remember when Tami was a little boy and he realized, oh, I want to be this doctor when I grow up. I want to achieve great things. And Mr. M nurtured and nurtured and nurtured. And then one day Tami realized, but because of Bantu education, I'm never going to be able to do that. I will never be able to be what I want to be. And Mr. M feels, so now take what you have and make the best of it. Generation gap. Tami feels, I want to fight for what I deserve. And Mr. M is saying, dude, yeah, you have this, take it and go. And that is why they say that Tami doesn't value it. He does value it, but not the Bantu education that he was receiving. Okay, he feels the fight for equal education takes priority. So what is he saying? He is willing to put his education on hold, his personal education, so that everyone has the opportunity to do what? Have equal education. Have education of equal value. Have education where as much money is spent on people of color as people or as white people, Indians, blacks, everybody. He wants everyone to have the same education. Okay, now, once again, remember, I'm going to keep going back to the fact that themes speak to our characters develop our plot. And that is why I've chosen to tell you who the characters are that are involved with the themes. Because you see, grade 12, you cannot study your drama in isolation. You have to study your drama as a whole. So characters, characterization, themes, those three things go together. And what do? They develop your plot, they develop your storyline, they tell you who people are, they tell you why they do things, and you start to understand your characters that much better. Okay, the next one that we are going to do is gender differences. Traditional cultures, women are seen as subservient or lower to men. The debate offers Tami and Isabel the opportunity to be equals, although they take different sides. Okay? Both see that gender differences actually are not so bad because we all have our strong suits. I have certain things, or women have certain things that are excellent, and men have certain things. So the two genders, they actually complement one another. And that is what they see, that it's actually not a liability, but an asset. And the great debate in Act 1, Scene 1, I'd like you to read it because the gender differences is based largely on that debate. Okay, power of words versus violence. I've already touched on this because Mr. M says, use your words. Why do you want to fight? Okay, why don't you have a debate or an argument? Why don't you talk to one another? Because that facilitates non-violence. Words give you the ability to have a peaceful negotiation. Whereas if you punch someone, they're going to punch you back. But if you say to someone, listen, I don't think that that's acceptable, what are they going to do? They're going to respond in kind, if they are rational people, we're assuming. Okay, and Mr. M, he has complete and utter faith in the power of words. So much so that he goes and he gives the learners' names to the police and is branded a traitor. Remember, however, his motivation was not that of a traitor. His motivation was because he had complete faith in the power of words and of education. And he wanted his learners back in the class, and he didn't want them fighting. He didn't want them to get hurt. Okay, but then later on, he realizes, you know what, I want to tell you a little story. Power of words and violence. In the story, what happens is Mr. M is walking and he sees a boy go in the police van. And the little boy shouts, he says, Mr. M, please tell my mother. You know, that he's in the police van. And he had been detained. Now remember, I mentioned previously, detained, political arrest without your name being given and your parents knowing. And Mr. M sees that and he thinks, I don't want that for my learners. I want these children to grow up and become somebody. And that is why he starts to realize, oh my word. And I can just see Mr. M going and hanging his head and saying, maybe we do need a little bit of action. And he realizes that, meaningful action, that words alone are sometimes not enough. Now remember, Tammy comes to warn Mr. M. He says, Mr. M, they're coming for you, they're going to kill you, you need to go. And Mr. M says, no. And I spoke to you about this in the last presentation where I said, Mr. M is actually killed. Now, why do you think Mr. M was willing to die? Because he realizes meaningful action. He realizes that he was wrong. He realizes that just talking, not enough. And that is why he is willing to stand for that and to admit, I was wrong. Sometimes words and actions actually do go together. Without one, the other one is ineffective. They are needed together to make it work. You can't just have words and no action, or just have action and no words. And Mr. M is beginning to realize the value of the power of words, and it's no longer verses. It is the power of words and action, as opposed to violence, because violence now starts to become action. Debate and order. I've discussed this with you. A lot of my things are going to overlap, but the PowerPoint slide is there for you as a reference to make sense of it, right? So where does it take place? On a level playing field using words and rational arguments. So that's what a debate is, right? It has rules, it creates equality, discipline, and order. Now remember, great debate right at the beginning. That sets the tone. Mr. M uses the bell. You remember Mr. M's bell? When he rings the bell. And he uses that. That's a symbol of his authority as the principal and as the teacher in the class, and as a symbol of keeping order and believing that debate and order can bring peace, can bring understanding. Debate is an example of the kind of non-violent and orderly future that Mr. M sees for South Africa, which, by the way, he eventually realizes cannot happen unless there are actions that go with the words. Okay. Language and literature. Now, this is the last one. The greatest souls the world has, I love this, the greatest souls the world has ever known. That's references to great literary works. And what does he say about language and literature? What does he say? Mr. M says, you want to come throw stones and you want to fight and you want to be mad? Do you know what, Ozymandias and all these great, Percy Bysshe Shelley, all of these great poets, They used words to do what? To share their joy, to share their love, to share their sorrow. They used words. They didn't fight. And he says, the greatest souls the world has ever known have used words, language and literature. Also, when they do the quiz, it's a literature quiz, so there's a lot of meaning attached to literature in this drama, and language and how it affects change, okay? And Tammy identifies with Lord Byron, however. Why? Because Lord Byron was a freedom fighter. So, language and literature, even there you can learn that sometimes you need actions and you need words. So he found a literary figure who was a freedom fighter. And that attracts Tammy, it draws him in. The poem, Ozymandias, you see the fate that awaits South Africa. This guy is very important. So you remember in the drama, Ozymandias ends up in the desert with like half a body and a head and whatever. And Mr. M, that poem by Ozymandias, that is where South Africa is headed. If they don't come to an understanding, if they don't do things the correct way. But Tammy doesn't see that. When he does that poem, he doesn't see the relevance of Ozymandias to his current situation. Okay, and this drama is littered with so much figurative language and speech and images like this. And it is amazing. And once you understand all of these things and the themes and how the characters fall into those themes and how they build the plot and how they drive the plot, then this drama opens up a whole new world, and it is no longer just about the apartheid era. It is in fact relevant today. Simply looking at the themes that we've covered, I think it's entirely relative, and you will be able to understand it. Justice. What is justice? We complained about that earlier. The way we treat people. Justice is about upholding the law. Tammy and the comrades says that apartheid in and of itself is unjust. So how do you uphold a law that is unjust? How do you maintain justice in an unjust system? And that is what that theme mostly deals with. And then Isabel, Mr. M, remember I explained to you how Mr. M is murdered, his necklace. Isabel doesn't believe that that is an example of just behavior. He doesn't deserve to die like that. So the theme of fairness and justice is examined throughout the drama, and these are perfect examples of that particular theme. So how Isabel feels and Mr. M's terrible fate, and how unfair his death is. Privilege versus poverty. I've covered that already as well. She's rich, he's poor. South Africa reflects the huge difference between those two. Remember, she comes from Kamdebo, he comes from Brakwater. Huge difference, even in just the way that the places look. Okay? And looking at the education, Bantu education. So can you see grade 12? Are you able to see how our themes overlap? Although there might be 12 themes, they are interrelated, as is characterization, as is dramatic irony, as is any other element of the drama. All these are interrelated, okay? And Isabel, she's naively, you know what naively means? She's like thinking, but this is how it should be. I grew up like this. It must be right. She doesn't know what apartheid is doing in the country, okay? Imagery and symbolism, I'm not going to go through that too much because I've discussed the similes and the metaphors. The slide is there for you. I've discussed with you the bell, the dictionary, the stone, Ozymandias, that is what that refers to, matchbox, the houses, how small they are, and the debate, most importantly the great debate, it represents the political arena in South Africa. Okay. Props and sound devices, most important one, bell, the other one, dictionary, the other one, the stone, and then Ozymandias. If we understand how those things are interconnected, then we understand props and sound devices. That concludes my presentation. I trust that you have learned some valuable information from it and that you will use this PowerPoint as a resource. Remember, I've uploaded question papers for you as well with the memo. Thank you so much for joining me, and thanks for listening.